Okay, hi there. We are back. Just one moment and set everything. Just one question no, 1 point for the speakers. I forgot to say that the session is recorded, and so I don't know if you have any problem with the video going public in next days.
No. Will be the video available for people not in the conference, or is just for the?
I think yes, at the end of the conference.
Okay.
If I'm not sure, but if it is as in past years, at the end of the conference, we will be able to download the video and upload on our channels. So this is our idea. Okay.
Thank you.
So, okay, we are more or less on time. The idea now is to have this, let's say, 20 minutes of discussion among all the speakers and people present here on both platforms. Just let me check if, yeah, there are also people on the WOA platform. Okay, just to start the debate, I will put on the table a couple of points. One point that I think has emerged in all the intervention is this necessity for, let's say, cross-cultural analysis of those phenomena, and also, I would say, situated analysis. I mean, in all your intervention, the last from Mark and the one from Fabiana, it was quite evident that the researcher has to need to have some kind of understanding of the society that he or she is studying. So in your opinion and in your experience, how much is like this, and how is the situation in general with this? Because my personal understanding is that quite everybody study data from US being working in Europe or East or some others. So what is your understanding of this thing, and what do you think is the next future in this field of research being to appear with respect to these kind of problems? So if you have any to say, Alberto, Fabiana, Mark, about that?
I can break the ice if you want. So I think that the researchers are, I mean, I think it depends also on the disciplines, the different disciplines. So the researchers are making the effort. I think one of the major obstacles, I believe, is the data access and availability on one side, and on the other side, the capability of working with this data. What I mean is that, of course, so I know I'm an Italian researcher. I can work with English. I can work with Italian. I can also work with sometimes with other languages. But some of these languages sometimes are, we are not able to deal with these languages because we do not know the language. We do not know the context, the social and also the political context. So, and in some cases, it's really also difficult to access the data. So, of course, these are limitations in the analysis that we can do, and there are also technical limitations in the sense of the sometimes also the models and techniques that are basically always developed for English. So, for example, sentiment analysis, topic modeling, and so on, all these available tools that we can leverage are always or usually, of course, because English is the most common language, but of course this is making more difficult to work with other languages. And this is why, for example, in the project I was presenting on hate speech, we were focusing on other languages than English. So for example, on Italian, on Slovenian, on Dutch. So languages where the models are not available and where the data sets, for example, for training the models are not available. Because there is less interest in these languages, because they, involve less people in terms of population. So these are the main obstacles. I think it's not really that, the researchers decide to avoid certain cultures or languages or countries. Sometimes it's difficulties, of course, in dealing with this context.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think what Fabiana was saying is probably the major problem. One thing I can say, so I happen to work in a psychology department, and in psychology this problem has been explored in the last few years. So like 10 years ago or more, I don't remember exactly. So there was a very famous paper that introduced this acronym WEIRD. So Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and Democrats, I think. So now it's pretty well known. And the problem was exactly that the majority, like the big majority of psychology studies were done basically on undergrad in some US universities or in some UK universities, and then people were using these results to generalize to humans without keeping into account cultural differences and the broader context. So I think this has been a positive development in psychology that maybe can be somehow exported also in other disciplines that in the end they also have to do with the human behavior and human psychology or social dynamics at some point. So I think is maybe something that can be at least interesting to look what they did and see if something similar can be done. Also open other interesting debate. For example, in case of psychology, I think you need to have some some motivation to do cross-cultural studies. For something can be like indeed more apply. You can apply them more generally to all humans, or so. But I think that in the case of social media studies, that's definitely important. I mean, the dynamics intuitively they should be very different in different societies, and as Fabiana was saying before, also different social media and all these.
Mark, for you?
Yeah, very few things to add. There's a clear lack of let's say global studies of social media or cross-country studies that span over different continents. And they are much needed. And I think that this ties well with the structure of the funding, right? So we might have European projects because of this European grant, might have American projects because of the type of funding that they have in the United States, but we lack this, let's say, global perspective because there's still not a lot of funds allocated for these global studies. So I would say it's also up to us to push for these agencies, funding agencies, to change a little bit not a little bit, to change the perspective and to recognize the need of studying societies beyond this Western context, where there is a lot to learn. Yeah, this is how I see.
Yeah, thank you. I think Antonio has something to put on the table for the discussion.
Hi, so I'm Antonio Calleja. I'm also, along with Emanuele Luce and Facte, part of the team of political communication networks. I work at the Open University of Catalonia. And actually, my first question, I was laughing with Emanuele, it was also connected to precisely this question, slightly more in, let's say, first epistemological sense. So back in 2018, there was this call by Leiser et al. For a science of fake news. And given some of the elements that you were pointing out, such as the influence of ethnocentrism, the influence of the control of the platforms on the kind of knowledge that we can gather, whether such a thing like a science of fake news is possible, especially first that, but then also trying to think of how you were constructing your analysis. Because Alberto was using some principles from cultural evolution, Mark was using homophily coming from sociology. And then at the same time, we had this question that every platform has a different set of rules or conditions, so to speak. So are there any principles that could be also specific to this area that are shared across platforms? And that are also different from, principles coming from other fields and that are translated into this new? Is there, I wanted to open this conversation about this idea of what this field can be or how it can be constituted in a more epistemological sense as a transdisciplinary field or something of the sort, or is there still too much to go to get there?
I can say something if you want. That's like a very difficult question. I'm not sure. So from my feeling about that is that given that social media or anyway related technology, basically they touch everything, it's strange for me to think about a science of social media or a science of fake news, because I mean you have everything that is like to say, and this. So what I would expect is that, which is kind of what we are trying to do, is that different approaches. So you need to have some kind of background, I think, in discipline that studies human behavior and social and cultural dynamics, and then using these tools to try to apply them to the different kind of dynamics that happen in social media. I don't think that everybody would agree to a set of principles that are used to study digital stuff, because it's everything. I mean, it doesn't make much sense to me now distinguish between online dynamics and sometimes people say in real life. I mean, there's no more. I mean, it's all together. So I think that I would not expect a shared science of fake news or something like that. But I do think that it's important to have tools from disciplines that study human behavior and social dynamics applied to this thing. If I can add on it, my bit of a concern, I was thinking about that. So I think that actually is the goals of these possible science, that is all this, the framing that has been done in terms of fake news, polarization, echo chamber. I'm less sure about that. I mean, this is something that we started to identify these objects a few years ago. And we, including myself, even if I have this kind of critical attitude, if you look at my paper, they have all misinformation in the title. Maybe for me, an interesting reflection would be to think what are the hidden or not that hidden influence of thinking in this framework, and if maybe there are other objects that we can cut differently the digital thing and having different objects of study.
Fabiana, Mark, you have something on this point?
No, I mean, I agree. I think I mean, we are, you know, you're always studying a much more complex phenomenon usually. So you're talking about misinformation, that you have to deal, you know, on vaccines, and then you have to deal with all the history and studies and literature around vaccination, trust in vaccination, trust in institutions. So it depends. So I mean, misinformation is this, you know, keyword, but in the end, you can. So it's so complex what you are usually dealing with that I do not think that. Also, it's even possible to define a science of misinformation or science of fake news, even because, especially when we're focusing on the digital environment and social media platforms, these platforms are, you know, continuously evolving and changing. So you also have to adapt, you know, your definitions, your approach to how the platform and the users and the population and the platforms evolve. So it's very difficult, but I think this is really highlighting also why it's really important to cooperate between the different disciplines and different sectors, because of course on one side we can have all these computational tools that allows us to, you know, investigate some phenomenon on very large scale and very, you know, at very high detail. On the other side, of course, also qualitative investigations can help in contextualize better what's happening, or in analyzing, you know, the differences between platforms and so on, for example. So I do believe that this is a topic where the interdisciplinarity, really in the sense of cooperation between the researchers, and not only, you know, in having, of course, these workshops are really interesting when we are together and when discussing together. I do feel that it's also very good when we are actually working together. So I felt this, for example, in the European projects, where you have these interdisciplinary teams, and then you have to work together, and you have to, these different perspectives really enrich what you're doing. So I was mentioning, for example, quality, and we had, you know, months in the project in defining what's quality, because it's really, you know, easy to say, okay, quality information, and then we have to define and to agree on what quality is, and this definition can change if the definition comes from a journalist or the definition comes from, I don't know, the general public. But in the end, on the other side, I want to measure this, for example, and so how can I do this? Okay, how can I measure the effectiveness? I do believe that in this sense, if we exchange principles and foundations and tools from different disciplines, we can really tackle this kind of phenomena in a more effective way. And on the other side, but we are evolving, I think, also the approach according to what's happening in not only in the platforms, but in general in our society.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Antonio. I wouldn't have a unique answer. I would say that ontologically and methodologically, I fully agree with Alberto and Fabiana that we need to really work to boost this interdisciplinarity. And now, how to do so? That could be the question. I don't want to talk again about the necessity of pushing these funding agencies to increase this interdisciplinary research. Another way could be also to, which don't happen very often, is to build actually PhDs where interdisciplinarity is one of the core, let's say, educational tools of the program. I think that the internet research, what is showing is that there's no time anymore, and especially social media, because of the scale and the speed, is that the time of very restricted disciplines with these clear boundaries is over. We cannot answer what is happening in social media or online without talking with other disciplines. That was the case already before, but perhaps now even more, because of the characteristics of these platforms and the impact that they are having on the way we communicate and the way we behave.
Yeah, also because I mean that's just to add a little, like founders, they're obviously all for interdisciplinarity on the paper, but I mean I remember I did a few years ago a ERC starting grant, which was exactly about what the book would have been. And so I was presenting a cool interdisciplinary project, etc. And then at the end of the grant, they asked me to choose the main discipline of in which the project should have been presented. So like, well, but the point is exactly that you should not have these. I don't know how it is now, but I didn't know what to put into it, because what is it? Anthropology, psychology, sociology? I don't know. So computer science. It's still a real problem, I think.
So actually, you sort of answered my second question, which was precisely about political epistemology. Especially you, Alberto, you were pointing out, like how concepts such as misinformation is later on used by authoritarian governments, or how it is used by the European Commission to steer funding in given directions. So I wonder, but at the same time, you that were pointing in that direction did not fully dig into that. I was wondering if we need some sort of political epistemology to address these issues at the same time that we are addressing the issues themselves, some sort of reflexivity there. But coming, in a more, let's say, fully fleshed way, rather than only pointing out. I think that was struck by your presentation in that direction. But beyond that, because I think you have already pointed that in your responses to my first question, I was wondering whether you could dig into something that some of you address slightly in the talks or the first response, which has to do with just some policy, if you want, recommendations going from epistemology into policy full-blown, when it comes to public institutions, then maybe, even civil society and the private sector, and especially also even what academia can do to steer them in the directions that, given your analysis, you think, all of you think that is best.
Shall I break one thing that I was saying would be like making interdisciplinarity more, I also see this when you are looking for a job. So I didn't have much problem to go from one postdoc to another, but then when you look for a faculty job, they say, okay, you need to be one of these discipline. So I think at institutional level, this is something that is really lagging behind what are the ideas that we can discuss, but then there's not a real change at the institutional level. I mean, it's not easy, and I don't have any solution to say how to do it, but it's still something that would be important to work. And this on the interdisciplinary aspect. On the other aspect, about this hidden framing of the research agenda, I think that's natural. I mean, you need some framing, so this would be, but I think now I would be interested in seeing some work that actually are reflecting on the current framing of digital studies or whatever we can call, and that, as I was saying, propose maybe to really a different frame of problems that we are studying, instead of what we did until now, starting to have different keywords and try to implement this keyword also in founding schemes, and I think this would bring a bit of fresh air in the system. I don't know myself, as I was saying, I'm completely within the framing, but there are other aspects that I think are interesting way to cut the research around different keywords. I'm thinking about I don't know, one thing that I think is interesting and not much study is the curation concept. Curation, so you have like the idea that you have, we all discuss about having an enormous amount of information, but then people select just some of them. So like thinking this in terms of selecting information without necessarily thinking in terms of fake news or polarization, but about system, human and artificial system that select information. This, for example, would be a different way to frame this similar problem, but in a slightly different way. And again, I would be interested in see people thinking in terms of different framing and see if something happens. That would be.
On that, I know, Fabiano, you have to go, but if you have just a few minutes, I will be really interested with respect to these policy things, in your relation directly with the EDGICOM, so with people working directly on the field and platform. What's the relations there? How is your experience working in this type of task force directly with them?
Okay, so with EDGICOM was kind of a collaboration in the sense of, we were working, maybe making analysis, they were supporting us. Of course, it's very useful to work within communications authority. They have lots of information, links also to, for example, social media platforms, but we are also cooperating with the social media platforms in this sense. So, for example, in the IRIS coalition. And that's something that is really, necessary on one side and pretty useful, because, of course, we as researchers, we can go on with our analysis, but I do believe that then in the end, it's important to interact with the platforms and the institutions to let the research fundings be, also used to frame the policies. So in this sense, all this analysis and the data that we have and the insights that we can gain, I think that can be used to drive the drafting of the recommendations. And so in some sense also to make, this kind of sometimes countermeasures approaches when of course it depends on what we're focusing on, but more effective, because at least you are drafting this based on what you are observing in the data, and the researchers in this sense are usually independent, and so I think it's important that also what we have in the literature and in the scientific community is considered outside in this kind of processes.
Thank you, Fabiana. I don't know if, Mark, you have something to add on this point?
Yeah, adding to what Fabiana and Alberto they were saying, I was thinking now the average time of social media use and internet use here in the Netherlands, if I well remember, it's around 2 hours per day on the use of social media and 5 hours on the use of the internet. And so I do not see, and today I was presenting here about the parliamentarians, I do not see yet, let's say, in in the parliaments or in the city councils, in these different levels of political, where there is the decision power, I would say discussions that they are at the level of what is happening in terms of the use of these of the online realm, right? So my feeling is that we are lagging behind, and that political institutions should listen to many of the stakeholders, not only few of these stakeholders, as it has mostly happened, especially these companies, right? And that we should definitely, pay a lot of attention to these issues, not only in a palliative way, let's say, but in a more constructive way. Let's say, thinking about education programs that transcend specific issues such as misinformation, polarization. What we want is a broader debate. What we want is, like, deeply reflect on what is happening and thinking along the lines with these different stakeholders, how we can build a better resilience with regard to these digital threats, and how we can use this realm in a positive way. There are many, and Alberto was mentioning many positive outcomes that can come, and that they are already there. It's just a matter of analyzing, seeing, and studying them.
Thanks a lot for the responses.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I had a problem with Zoom that crashed just now, but okay. Thank you to all of you for participating in this debate and for your presentations. So we are quite late on schedule, so I think we have to quit now this discussion. It was very fruitful. I hope we will have more opportunity in the future with these workshops to keep on the discussion, hopefully in person next time. So thank you again to all of you, and Fabiana said to leave, but obviously we thanks her also. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Now it's time for the Camille presentation that, as I told, it will be a video presentation because of some problem he had with a fly. So just a moment, I have the video here. Yeah, so I just want to introduce Camille. Camille Roth's research lines are at the interface between social and computational sciences, and they featuring keywords such as social semantic systems, STEM, social cognition, algorithms, and mathematical sociology. So during last year's, his research project dealt on blog networks, scientific communities, and peer-to-peer platforms. And his keynote talk today is on serendipity and or confinement. I will now try to play the video and enjoy.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be able to share this presentation with you, even though I have to record it from a delayed airport as a result of unexpected plane rescheduling, which means I can't be live tonight in time to present this with you. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me, and hope this is fine this way. wanted to address the debate between serendipity and confinement in online social networks, especially online public spaces, whether users tend to be in cohesive clusters, interacting mostly with same-minded users, or if there is serendipity or opportunities for serendipity in those networks, and in which areas and under which conditions. So very much not trying to solve this debate, but rather frame it, especially starting with a corollary of confinement, which is fragmentation, and focusing on an old result based on the observation that blog networks were pretty much socio-semantically clustered. You have clusters of blue users, clusters of red users, blue and red corresponding to Democratic or Republican-leaning users in an American context, and they are clustered and they have much less connections between them. So essentially fragmentation and possibility of confinement of these users who are essentially exposed to same-minded users. It's a result that's been replicated in many other citation like networks, such as retweets on Twitter, many times over the last 2 decades, and also nuanced, especially with the wealth of recent research results, where what we can call cross-cutting links, that is between different colors, are also quite often present on many platforms as well, including YouTube, Reddit, Twitter again, and emphasizing the role of some users in bridging these socio-semantically cohesive clusters. This fragmentation, confinement also depends on time. For instance, in this case, focusing on the French presidential elections in 2017 and looking at clusters associated with specific candidates, some support for specific candidates, you can see that across time, that's x-axis. Some clusters merge, some clusters disappear, some clusters split, some clusters appear. And so for any time slice, there is a different configuration of the possibility of confinement between those socio-semantic communities. This is something that extends to stay at the meso level to linguistic spaces. There's also a stream of research that has demonstrated that even in a single country, in a multilingual country, you can observe this kind of linguistic confinement between users using predominantly a certain language or a certain couple of languages. For instance, in Qatar, visually on the left, you see that the Arabic-speaking group of users is not so much connected with the massively English-speaking group of users. This is something that you can also observe in Switzerland, with the French-speaking community being quite remote from the German-speaking community and the English-speaking one in the middle. So there is each of these metagraphs that represents the connection of some linguistic community demonstrates some level of confinement of these different clusters. This also extends to the articulation between this meso level of linguistic communities and the micro level of the involvement of users across these linguistic spaces. And so this brings us to some research we've done at 2 occasions with a set of colleagues, looking at specifically the question of the existence of a European public space, and answering also pretty much the same as we would like to answer the question of serendipity or confinement, to say it depends on topics. It relates to an old debate on the existence of a European public sphere in political science, featuring 2 positions: that there is possibly some European reporting featuring common frames across Europe, so the existence of a European public sphere, or the non-existence of it. Even though the same topics are being addressed, there is no transcendence between the different linguistic spaces. Each space reports and frames the issues in a very different manner, in a very disconnected manner. It's also related to research that has tried to more visually map networks of websites, for instance, across countries in Europe, and looking at the interconnection between these websites across countries, and looking at the core and the existence of a core of websites that could act as a bridge between the different linguistic spaces. And all these issues are being addressed in a way that assumes that there is an answer to find in broad terms. You know, there is trying to skip the airport announcements. So yeah, no blanket answer to this question. So to this end, we empirically focus on data sets extracted from Twitter on the occasion of the 2014 and 2019 European elections, and to examine the level of fragmentation and integration of the set of users associated with a certain language across topics. Essentially, the two collection events are related to these two elections, focusing on the parameter of 3-4 languages, 3 for the first one, 4 for the second one, German, French, English, and then Italian. That covers around half of the EU population in terms of native language. And every time was based on a selection of relevant hashtags for the election in all these languages. And so the question is, if we are able to extract networks of users and clusters, linguistic groups of users, depending on topics, can we show that there is a continuum or not of integration between these linguistic spaces depending on topics? So for instance, that's the middle figure, it's a toy figure. German, English, French communities being quite integrated or totally separated in the case of topic T2. We use two different text processing approaches. One of them is automatic, based on polylingual LEA, trying to extract word distributions associated with multilingual topics, that is, topics that are defined on subsets of words in the 3 different languages, German, English, and French. The second approach is more basic in a way, but also more precise. It relates to the automatic extraction of 57,000 hashtags, but then the manual coding of the 1,000 most popular ones, which covers 90% of all hashtag uses and yields manually labeled topics like climate, environment, energy that are based on a list of hashtags that are assuredly connected with this manually labeled topic. In the first case, we can frame the question of the integration of these linguistic spaces and the confinement thereof using 2 dimensions. One is the simple concentration of a topic on the different linguistic spaces, which is a dispersion index. C, that is the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, that essentially says whether a topic is only addressed, for instance, in the French-speaking group or in all groups. And so depending on topics, we have a different level of concentration. That some topics are addressed somewhere and not elsewhere, and others are addressed everywhere. The other dimension, which relates to the integration between the linguistic spaces, is summarized by the index Xi, which corresponds to the typical academic H index. And that represents the percentage of users who have a certain percentage of outgoing links towards the other linguistic space. For instance, for topic 27, Brexit, and the German-speaking users, they have a Xi index of 0.5, which means 50% of these users make 50% of their links towards the other communities. And for topic 10, internet issues in the French-speaking sphere, this Xi index is much smaller. And so what we observe is that there is the double dichotomy of topics, that for some topics they have a very small concentration and or very small C, which means they are very concentrated in a certain space, and the small Xi, which means they are very much introvert, like for instance, internet politics. Others are quite extrovert, but only in a specific sphere, like Ukraine. Others are introvert, but addressed everywhere, which corresponds pretty much to this case, political science case of being addressed everywhere, but without any connection, like internet and Brexit. And there's one topic which actually corresponds to being addressed everywhere with a large level of integration, which is the question of refugees. So in that case, you get a differentiated answer to the question of the existence of the European public sphere. In stronger network terms, if we look at the metagraph of these linguistic groups, for instance, for a certain topic, and so here we switch to the manual hashtag classification, climate, environment, and energy, we see that there is quite a certain level of introversion or internal linking in the English or German speaking groups, the French ones, and also some level of interconnection as well. All of this can be summarized with two indices, the Hirschman index on the diagonal links on the diagonal cells of this metagraph matrix, which corresponds to the intra-block link concentration. That means to what extent the introvert links are concentrated in a certain linguistic group or not, and the non-diagonal dispersion index, which corresponds more to the existence of links between those groups. So H diagonal means there is a high concentration, a high dispersion, sorry, of the topic for certain linguistic spaces, and the non-diagonal index relates to the fact that there are interconnections between those groups. And so we see a quite diverse picture of the induced networks for each of these topics, that some of them are concentrated, some of them are not, and some of them are displaying some level of integration, and others are not. So network shapes that could be classified based on its two indices and the simple aggregative clustering methods in different families of metagraphs being graphs at the level of the linguistic communities, and that exemplify different ways of discussing things. For instance, in family 3, economy, finance, development, we have essentially quite linguistic-centric communities. Media, everything that's related to the media is the same, while some topics are specifically related to a certain sphere, like Brexit is heavily spoken about in the English-speaking community, and other issues are more integrated, like climate, environment, which demonstrates some level of interconnection between the spheres. So here again, the question of serendipity between linguistic communities at the European level or confinement depends very much on the topic. Another dimension of dependence of fragmentation, serendipity, confinement on something is the type of link. And that's also a quite old result that, for instance, even in the same platform, looking at retweets or mentions on Twitter, exhibits a different level of social semantic cohesiveness. Like on the left here, it's this work by Conover and colleagues in 2011. Twitter network demonstrates the same type of result as Blog and Glance and Atomic. There's two spheres, blue and red, quite disconnected. But if you look at mentions, then all of a sudden, this homophily, this very strong social semantic assortativity of nodes disappears to a large extent. It's something that's been replicated in different contexts with more colors. And this roughly relates to the fact that the commonly observed right left-wing bi-clustering and citation affiliation networks is not necessarily replicated in different types of networks. There is a mix of supportive and oppositional relationships, especially with mentions, with discussions, with replies. There is less homophily. And affiliation, that is retweeting dryly someone, exhibits much more fragmentation than interaction, which exhibits more integration. In a recent work that's been published about 6 months ago, that's called Quoting is Not Citing, we try to disentangle these two phenomena. And so we focus on quote trees, that is, trees of quotes that are generated by a root tweet. A tweet is being published, and then users may retweet plainly that original tweet. They may also quote it. I mean, it's sort of a retweet with a comment. So in that case, there is a sort of reframing, which is also graphically the case because Twitter, the Twitter platform, actually displays the original tweets in a frame. And so there's the comments above it. So it's a specific type of retweet, which also makes it possible to trace the genealogy of the quotes. Quote of a quote of a quote can be traced. And in this case, this is an interesting ephemeral structure that develops against the more stable backdrop of political affiliations of users. It means we can color users in blue and red and look at how a given tweet simultaneously, I mean, within the same event, may give birth to reactions across different communities, of different colors. And this also aims to illustrate results on the use of quotes as a possibly antagonistic tool for conversations. So to color users, we use their follower network and the followee network, actually. So it's a quite stable network. It doesn't depend on time as in terms of aggregating a certain amount of data to constitute a network. At any point in time, there is a list of followees that is well defined. And so these networks evolve pretty slowly. They are also being used to color users since half a dozen years, based on an old political science technique of projecting individuals on a unidimensional axis depending on what they support. So tell me who you follow, tell me which bill you vote for, and I will tell you on which side of this political spectrum you are. Basically, that's what it's about. And so we use 10,000 users following at least 10 of the elites that are manually created that we took for a French public space here. So focusing on the French public sphere, I forgot to specify, but now we're looking at about 16,000 users of the French public sphere in 2020. And we have this distribution of ideal points, IP, which when negative tend to correlate with being left-wing leaning, positive correlated with right-wing leaning, and around zero quite close to the center. Also political figures that are close to the center, or news agencies or media that are relatively central. And we look at the discrepancy between the way users retweet, the discrepancy between how users retweet and how they quote. So for a given retweet, there is a certain set of retweets and there is a certain set of quotes. The retweets are made by users who have a certain IP value, so political affiliation, and quotes the same. And so at the first layer, the left graph shows for all trees, given a certain IP value for the root tweets, the average IP value of retweets and or quotes for the crosswords. And so retweets pretty much follow the political affiliation of the root tweet. There is a sort of very strong correlation between them, and the quotes display a little bit of a discrepancy. The discrepancy increases very much for large trees, and also very much not shown here for trees that are a little bit off the center or published by users who are off the center. So in a nutshell, that means that retweets correspond on average to the original IP of the IP of the original user who published the root tweets, while quotes tend to recenter and tend to go back to the center as much as the tree is large, so it attracts a lot of people, or the tree has been originated by a user which is up the center. So this reframing action is actually a recentering action, featuring a lot of serendipitous connections. And so to summarize, these trees exemplify this concurrent existence of purely confined actions like retweets and purely serendipitous actions like quotes. Mix of cross-cutting and reinforcing assortative and disassociative behavior. If we look at how users are characterized by this kind of behavior, we get a little bit of the same picture. Users generally retweet along their IP value. That means the other way around. They tend to retweet content that has the same IP value on average. This is the left graph that represents the average value, IP value of retweets with respect to the original value of the user. For quotes, the situation is more diverse. I mean, as we saw, quote trees attract users from different backgrounds, let's say, from different political backgrounds. But we see that for users who are more off the center, as the middle density plot here, there is a certain proportion of users who are quoting where they retweet, and others who are quoting outside of the area where they retweet. That means that there is much more diversity when we are getting up the center in terms of the typical behaviors of users who would quote root tweets that are of the same family or not. And so this is also exemplified with the violin plots on the right, where we see a much more spread of this behavior of the discrepancy between the average quote and the average retweet for users who have a more of the center IP value. So to summarize here, quoting is a way of reframing and also a way of recentering. Retweets are explicitly and expectedly affiliation links, and quotes are more diverse. There is some recentering. There is also damping. I mean, if you look at the second level of the tree or the third level of the tree, this sort of pull towards the center and then pull back towards the, not the center, and then pulls back towards the center again. So this kind of ping pong exhibits a sort of damping. It means that there is much, there is increasingly recentering, but with decreasing magnitude, and especially so for larger and the non-central trees. And same goes with the user-centric observations with the variety that is also confirmed qualitatively with the brief qualitative analysis and a random selection of profiles for each of the 5 user regions of this density plot, which reveals that the users who are quoting in their family also have specific self-presentation patterns and specific quoting patterns qualitatively. There are, for instance, the ones that are quoting in the same family, they are quite explicit about their party affiliation. They're like, oh, I support this candidate or I support this party. While the critical ones, the ones that are quoting with cross-cutting quoting are more critical, and they are rather emphasizing their free thought without specifying their political affiliation. So there is serendipity and confinement at the same time along the same content. Another issue that is quite connected with serendipity and confinement, but it's possibly orthogonal and not necessarily involved in networks, is the question of filter bubbles that I wanted to spend some time on as well here. Especially because, I mean, filter bubbles are related to algorithmic reinforcement, to the notion that algorithms are feeding users with content that is aligned with their preferences, and that this is this assumption that they are possibly consuming confined content. And the debate is whether algorithms, recommendation algorithms in particular, do that or do the opposite, that is, that they are actually expanding the horizon of users. This question may be totally asocial in a sense. For instance, if you look at music streaming platform, users are alone, not interacting with other users, so there is no social network, but still interacting with the recommendation algorithm. So you can really frame this question without networks. And just the same with serendipity and confinement, you could imagine that you have online social platforms like blogs, for instance, where algorithmic recommendation plays almost no role. So the question of echo chamber, serendipity and confinement of networks, or the question of filter bubbles, serendipity or confinement of algorithms are quite orthogonal, even though they meet sometimes when you have social networks that feature also heavily recommendation algorithms. That being said, I just want to focus on filter bubbles to also demonstrate to what extent this question of serendipity and confinement depends. It depends on the users in this case. And so the state of the art on the question of filter bubbles seems to be going in one direction, which is that they are not very bubbly, those filters. There is a series of recent results over the last decade on different platforms with different protocols, also different empirical assumptions as well. So difficult to compare, but on the whole, there is a series of results that seem to say there are no such thing as filter bubbles. Algorithms do expand the horizon of users, except in one case, which is the case of explicit preferences. When you're asking the platform to feed you with stuff explicitly, then there is confinement. For instance, if you subscribe on Twitter on a certain list of accounts, then you are being fed almost as an order with content stemming from these accounts. So there is this exception, but it's not only the exception. Actually, there are some cases where the literature, for instance, on Spotify, which is also a platform where other works seem to say that there is serendipity, other works seem to say there is confinement. And also YouTube, so a recent paper of us, Tubes and Bubbles, where we show that there is a certain level of confinement on YouTube in the recommendation networks induced by videos, especially videos that are among the most viewed. And so in a recent work where we had used data from Deezer, the music streaming platform, we could tackle this question of serendipity versus confinement by reframing the question and making it depend on user types. Also, in a case where we had two types of recommendation, a human one and an algorithmic one. In a nutshell, on the streaming platform, you can just look for content, and that would be organic surfing. You can also get recommendations on content that could be algorithmic, if you ask the platform to recommend stuff. Or you can also look for what's called playlists that are editorial curated playlists made by people who are paid by Deezer, for instance. There are employees at Deezer, and so this is a sort of guidance that is definitely not algorithmic, that is more akin to what you have with music radio programming. And so we have user listening histories describing which mode of access had been used by users to access such or such content, organic, editorial, algorithmic, which sums to one, of course, if you look at the whole history and you look at the proportions, and makes it possible to place each user on a ternary plot that describes the position of this user in terms of the proportions of use of organic, editorial, or algorithmic access. So each dot here is a user, and you see that there are varied uses of the affordances of the platform and the various recommendation devices that are offered, which made it possible for us to propose a simple classification based on a k-means with k equals 4 that defines 4 classes of users. Ones who are labeled as being algorithmic, others as editorial, others as organic, and organic plus, who are heavily relying on organic access. Actually, it corresponds to quite a sizable part of the users on this platform who are not using recommendation devices at all. On the right, we see the amount of plays, so that is the activity on the platform, which is quite comparable from a user class to another one, except maybe editorial users who are using a little bit less the platform. That means there are as many users, or there are comparable proportions of users who are using heavily the platform or non-heavily the platform, or each of these user types. And so we introduced 2 dimensions of diversity. One is structural, the other one is more semantic. The structural dimension of diversity is essentially related to the exploration-exploitation trade-off made by users when they listen to stuff. That means they have a certain number of plays, and that corresponds to a catalog that is as large, at most as large as this number of plays. So the number of unique songs in the catalog. And so S over P, the number of unique songs over the number of plays, describe the redundancy, if you like, of the user listening history, whether they listen to one song the whole time, in which case S over P tends towards 0, or whether they listen to each song just one time, in which case S over P equals 1. And so the structural diversity of the catalog depends very much on the user type and the mode of access. Like on the rows, you have the mode of access, algorithmic, editorial, organic, and the columns are types of users. So for instance, algorithmic users on the left tend to be quite diverse when they use the editorial recommendation, but quite redundant when they use the algorithmic or the organic modes. That means they are exploiting the catalog much more, algorithmic users, when they use algorithmic recommendation or organic access, editorial. And so we have varied types of behaviors here, depending on the... And if we look at the more semantic notion of diversity, which is summarized here by the 4 possible values on the x-axis, nu1, nu2, nu3, nu4, they correspond to the type of artists that are being listened to. So we distinguish mainstream artists, that are the artists that are the most listened to, and niche artists, the nu4, which are the artists who are the least listened to. And each of the curve here corresponds to an over or under representation of these artists in the listening history with respect to a uniform baseline, where the share of listening to these artists would correspond to their popularity. The most popular artists would be listened to more often, for instance. And so each line here in each box corresponds to a certain mode of access. So for instance, algorithmic is the dashed line, editorial is the dotted line, and the solid line is organic. And so for instance, if you look at the editorial users on the top, you see that they tend to overconsume mainstream content and underconsume niche content for all modes of access. While algorithmic users, for instance, it's a little bit more nuanced, like they except when they use the editorial access, where they overconsume, like everyone, by the way, mainstream artists, they tend to underconsume mainstream artists and overconsume niche artists when they use the organic access. And the algorithm has more of a U shape. That means it tends to recommend much less mainstream stuff, less niche stuff, and more intermediate stuff. And so the picture is varied according to each of the user types. So what that means here is that the answer to the question of does algorithmic recommendation actually confine users to a certain type of mainstreamness, for instance, of artists, or do they tend to push them toward more exploitation of their catalog and less exploration? All of this actually depends very much on the user types based on behavioral features that are more low level and that make the answer to this serendipity confinement question quite diverse. So all of this, and maybe all of this works through, despite the quite bad conditions for recording this talk, to try to emphasize the idea that this debate in serendipity confinement, cross-cutting, reinforcing, requires and would maybe benefit very much from introducing this underlying variable which is the type of links, the type of topic, or the type of user, and the type of behavior that should not be circular, of course, but that makes it possible to understand why some works tend to conclude in one direction one time and other works tend to conclude in another direction. That there is these conflicting results may be accommodated within a single framework. Thank you for your attention, despite the pauses and some announcements. I'm sorry I can't answer questions online, most likely in transit in the bus when it's the time, but thank you again.
Okay, this was the presentation from Camille Rods. Quite a pity it's not here. Problem. He had this problem with the transportation. And so now I want just to thank you again, all the speakers of this PCNet 22 session. And I want, I want also to thank all the other organizers, Luce Prignano from the Universidad de Barcelona, Antonio Calleja from the Universidad Oberta de Catalunya, and Fakte Granizal from the Sheriff University of Technology. So thank you all the people here for attend also. And let's hope the next workshop, the next PCNet 23 will be in person. And that's all from me. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you again to the organizer and to everybody. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Yeah. Have a nice evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.